Here are six interview questions we asked in a very recent consultant interview. Question number one: why have you applied for this job? As simple as that. Question number two: tell me about a time when you had to work right at the edge of your comfort zone or you were pushed beyond your comfort zone. Question number three: tell us about what operational pressures you've come across or are aware of. Question number four: tell us about a time when you've had a difference of opinion with a colleague. Question number five: tell us about a time when you had to work in a toxic environment. And question number six: how do you ensure that everybody in your team feels included? So those were the six questions, and we'll go briefly into each of those questions and perhaps some of the answers that people gave and what we were expecting as part of the panel. So question number one was, why have you applied for this job and why should we give you this job? Something on those lines, which is a version of tell us a bit more about yourself. In this, we were basically expecting you to tell us exactly what we asked. Why have you applied for this particular position in this particular hospital? And why now? Why this, etc., etc. Most candidates answered pretty much on point. There wasn't much to go off point on this. What I think we would have preferred was if it had been more holistic answers. Most answers were to do with I've been doing X, Y, Z. I've been um, a fellow or a senior registrar or a locum consultant elsewhere. I've either come to the end of my time there, or I think it's time to move on to the next bit, etc., etc. And I think this one suits me because in your job you said something about education that I love doing. Um, I love teaching, blah blah blah. So most of the answers were focused around that. What would have set you apart would have been if you had gone on to describe what other things you had done in making yourself valuable. That is, whatever way the question is asked, you talk about what you've done that stands you apart from other candidates who are going to appear after you or have appeared before you. So things like, have you been involved in any QI projects? And even very small things about it, just interesting snippets to almost arouse the interest of the interview panel. Because by the time you get to question number, sorry, candidate number three or four, it kind of starts to get a bit repetitive. So any interesting facts that you can throw in there will just pique the interest of the panel, and I think will stand you in good stead. Question number two that I asked was, tell me about a time when you had to work right at the either outside your comfort zone or right at the edge of your comfort zone. And this didn't take the candidates as much by surprise as I thought it would. Um, One of the candidates talked about, they thought about it for a while. And I think between the candidates, there was a mixture of two things. There was a mixture of either a clinical situation where the patient was really unwell and they needed a hand and somehow they felt edgy. And that's the sort of thing that I think we can all identify with. We've all been there, and that's like being on the edge of the comfort zone. So a clinical situation with a really unwell patient, and the other situation, which some people describe, was operationally speaking, they were stretched to the limit, where they had, I don't know, two or three theaters running, and they were being called down to resus for another sick patient, and obstetrics was going off, and ICU was going off, and most people went on to describe how they managed the situation by calling for help. I think most of the resolution took place by gathering extra forces and talking through the candidates talking us through their thinking. And I think that was the right thing to do. Most candidates approached it really well, I thought. Uh, they talked us through what went on in their head, what their idea of the situation was, what were they thinking at the time. Almost like watching a reality TV show when the candidates go behind the camera in a closed room and talk to the camera about that situation as if it was happening there. Some of these situations are quite interesting and quite easily identifiable with. So I don't know how much, obviously, this isn't something that gets asked very, very commonly, but I think the candidates did very well and a lot of people should be able to. But I think, in my opinion, at least, it was a very fair interview question. Where's your comfort zone? Where does it end and where does it start? Would I have said something else in terms of my comfort zone? I think you can stretch it. I think this is the extent of where you can stretch it. At least thinking right now, I'm not sure if I hadn't already prepared for something like this, I probably wouldn't go far beyond something clinical or something operationally really, really challenging. I mean, the one thing that I could think of when it springs to mind is also operational uh, and clinical. The clinical one is, I remember herpes sepsis in a 10-day-old baby when I was doing my CATS fellowship. I mean, that was a really sick kid. And operationally speaking, there's been the times when the shop floor is running absolutely thin and there is increased demand. And I think I've now reached the stage where I can confidently go, no, you need to stop something because it's getting too dangerous. Anyway, moving on to question number 3, which was, what do you understand or operational pressures do you see around you? And I think the person who asked this question was trying to get to the stage of, can you interrupt that process anywhere before it gets really bad and the operational pressures get really bad so that you can actually prevent it? Again, most candidates answered questions based on the flow of patients through theaters, recovery being full, wards being full, bed pressures, number of emergencies coming in together. Um, Operationally, could they have done something better? I think the expected answer here was that I would look at list planning a bit better, get involved with that aspect of things, which as resident doctors, you probably don't get involved too much with the list planning side of things and what's known as clinical stratification. I mean, all hospitals do a clinical stratification at some point during the week, but more so when there's a resident doctor strike going on. Things need to be stratified because there's only so much you can do in absence of resident doctors. So I think that was what was expected. uh, I think a smaller percentage of candidates said that they would do that, and those were the candidates who'd been locum consultants before and knew about the forward-looking processes that were there in other hospitals or in our hospital. But it's a good one to go away and think about or speak to your clinical director or clinical governance lead about where this happens and whether you can just sit in on one of those to see what the processes are. It's a good one to develop for your interviews. Moving on to question number 4, that was an interesting one which one of my colleagues asked, and that question was, have you tell us about a time when you've had a difference of opinion with a colleague? uh, Again, very few people found that quite easy to answer, but they had to think a fair bit before they could answer the question. And the situation they described was where a patient's airway management plan had been made by several different people together, like about 3 or 4 consultant anesthetists and about 2 or 3 consultant ENT surgeons. And this was the classic one with a neck mass who needed uh, surgery in an emergency. there was the debate about should we do a fiber optic, and it turned out that fiber optic was a bad idea because they couldn't even tolerate a little bit of sedation. And then it turned out to be it changed and evolved as the team talked through the situation. So the candidate made they drew a good picture of what was going on in that anesthetic room, of the discussions that happened, and eventually the fact that the simpler option turned out to be better when they simply anesthetized the patient, and instead of going down the awake fiber optic route, they took the quicker route, which was to do a video laryngoscopy and get the tube down that way. And this patient then successfully went on to have the procedure that they were meant to procedure. But the interesting thing was that the candidate described the dynamics in the anesthetic room at the time between the anesthetists, the ENT surgeons, the different ENT surgeons, and the different anesthetists, and how they were, as being the lead anesthetist for that case, were able to sort of keep their cool and direct the direction of the discussion towards a productive outcome rather than ending up, collapsing in a heap. That was, I think, the best example. Uh, Others did not come up with very convincing examples of difference of opinion. They talked about situations where they'd had, most people said they were quite flexible. Um, they'd go along with the flow. They'd try to make a bit of an argument if they thought it was in the best interest of the patient, and they would eventually, the most people want to say that they're quite open and malleable. Now, whilst this is a good trait in itself, the fact that you are adaptable to the systems, I think it's quite important to stress upon the fact that you have a point of view, and that if you've got a point of view, you've got to be able to do two things. One is defend that point of view, and B, if you cannot defend that point of view, then you are grown up enough to change your thinking and adapt to the new situation, which I think both of which were displayed really well with the one very good example that we got from one of the candidates. Um, then question number 5 was about the toxic culture in an environment. The toxic culture in the environment came about for at least some of the candidates. I asked in a different order to where I'd intended to, because they talked about politics in the department, or they talked about bruised egos within the department. And I sort of asked how you would handle toxic culture and whether you'd come across any toxic culture. A couple of people said, no, they hadn't come across any toxic culture, and that they had seen bad things being done to bad people, sorry, not to bad people, bad things being done to other colleagues, and they were sort of empathetic to them and helped and supported them. But no one actually said that they'd been victimized or anything like that. One person, again, with a very good answer, said that they had been in an environment where you could have certain parts of the department, maybe a particular subspecialty, people could get quite possessive about who works in a particular theater or with a particular surgeon or in a particular specialty, and that you really need to have done your time in that department and please the right people to have come out as eligible to be able to work in that setting. And they sort of had their own take on it, in that they didn't quite like that particular system, but they figured out that if they were really interested in that particular branch of anesthesia, they would have probably gone off to a different department or a different hospital and tried to find a job elsewhere, because it wasn't upon them to try and reform the whole department themselves in one go, which makes sense. Other things about toxic cultures and environment that I tried to get out of the candidates was, how would you flag this problem and how would you escalate this problem? So most people said that flag it to the CD, And my follow up to that was, what if the CD and the entire leadership team within the department were indeed those toxic people? Um, Someone mentioned HR to that. And then I really pushed this candidate and asked, well, would you actually go to HR? And how easy or difficult is the process of going to HR? So let's say you had a disagreement, it would be quite a battle to fight. Would you actually do that? And again, the candidate made a very valuable and balanced arguments about the pros and cons of going to HR, with the pros being that you're obviously standing up for the right thing, and the cons being that the process is pretty much irreversible. Because once you flagged something to HR, you can't come back from there. You got to go through with it, because you can't say that I'm being I don't know, I'm being bullied, and then turn around and say, actually, no, I'm not being bullied. I just, yes, you can withdraw an application or complain like that, but it's a bit like digital spaces. It stays there forever. So the candidate made very valid arguments about the pros and cons, and I think that once again came out to be the best answer. Not many of the others did, though. And then the final question was about inclusivity. How do you make or have you come across a situation in the workplace where you've made people feel inclusive, or the workplace has been non-inclusive to certain groups of people? Um, the one very good example out of this was, and I think it was a true example, was about transgender changing rooms amongst theatre staff, and the fact that people have different points of view about who should get changed where, and things can get really, really sensitive. So the only way forward sometimes is to have a written down policy and system around it, which acknowledging the fact that not every single individual will be happy about it. You've just got to have that written down as a system, and that's a system that needs to be followed. Others did not quite answer that question that well. Some people spoke about the fact that when they first took on the role of a locum consultant elsewhere, that in itself was quite a challenge and a transition for them. But again, nothing about discrimination. I think what they were trying to imply was that because they weren't trained in the UK, they felt that the system was a little bit different. But again, we're at pains to explain that um, there was some cultural differences which took them time to get used to and understand. And they made a valid point about the fact that if they came across other people from similar backgrounds as themselves or other people, they would sort of go out of their way to explain to them that, it's all right to speak up, even though it might not be all right to speak up in your culture or in the work environment that you've come from. So there's the 6 questions. Hope you found these useful. Watch out for the next video. See you next time. Bye.